The ring hit the tray table before he could speak. 5 years. Gone in a single gesture. Nathaniel Cole stood in the doorway of room 412, flowers in hand, the word sorry dying in his throat, because she wasn't alone. 2 small faces peered at him from behind the hospital blanket. Strangers. Except one of them tilted his head at exactly the angle Nathaniel's mother used to call the Cole way. Why did that feel like a warning? Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. Nathaniel had rehearsed the drive over. He'd gone through it 3 times on the highway, what he would say, how he would say it, where he would stand so she didn't feel cornered. He'd even chosen the flowers carefully. White ones. Not romantic. Just sincere. The kind that said I'm sorry without asking for anything back. He hadn't spoken to Vivian in 3 years. Then a mutual friend called that morning and said she'd been in a minor accident, nothing serious, a fender bender, but she was being kept overnight for observation. Something shifted in his chest when he heard it. Something old. He was in the car before he'd made a conscious decision to go. Room 412 was near the end of a quiet hallway. The door was halfway open. He knocked once and pushed it gently. And then he stopped. Vivian was sitting up in the hospital bed, a bandage along her left forearm, her hair pulled back the way she always wore it when she was tired. She looked thinner than he remembered. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped him. It was the 2 small boys sitting beside her. They were pressed together at the edge of the visitor's chair, identical in the way that made you look twice, then a third time. Dark-haired. Quiet. Maybe 3 years old, maybe a little older. One was drawing something on the back of a pamphlet. The other was watching Nathaniel with the calm, unblinking attention that only very small children can get away with. There was no nurse. No other adult. No one to explain. Nathaniel looked at Vivian. And that was when he saw it, not surprise on her face, not even anger. Just dread. Pure and immediate, like someone who had been waiting for a specific knock at the door and had hoped it would never come. She didn't say his name. She reached to the tray table beside her bed, picked up something small, and slid it across the surface toward him. It came to rest near the edge, catching the overhead light. The engagement ring. His grandmother's ring. The one he'd placed on her finger 5 years ago in a restaurant where the food went cold because neither of them wanted to stop talking. He'd assumed she'd returned it through Gerald years ago. He'd assumed wrong. She'd kept it. And now she was giving it back in a hospital room with 2 toddlers watching. Nathaniel set the flowers on the windowsill because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. Vivian. His voice came out lower than he intended. Who are they? She looked at the boys, then back at him. Her answer was 2 words, no softness in them at all. They're mine. Not ours. Not a friend's kids. Not it's complicated. Just, mine. Flat. Final. A door closing. The boy who had been drawing looked up from his pamphlet. He studied Nathaniel the way children study new people, without politeness, without pretending not to stare. Then his eyes dropped to Nathaniel's wrist. To his watch. It was nothing unusual. A simple silver watch, the kind his father had worn, and his father before that. Nathaniel had put it on without thinking this morning. The boy's face shifted into something like recognition. Daddy has one like that, he said. Simple. Calm. The way children say true things. The room went very quiet. Nathaniel didn't move. He waited for Vivian to correct the boy, to explain, to say no, sweetie, that's not, but she didn't. She flinched. A small, sharp movement, like someone who'd been expecting an impact and still wasn't ready when it came. Then she looked away, toward the window, jaw tight. The boy had already gone back to his drawing. Nathaniel picked up the ring from the tray table. It was warm from her hand. He closed his fingers around it and put it in his jacket pocket, and then he stood there for one more moment, long enough to know she wasn't going to say anything else, long enough to understand that whatever he'd come here to do, it was no longer the point. He walked out. The hallway was too bright. His footsteps were too loud. He pushed through the exit door and stood in the cold air of the parking structure for what felt like a very long time, his car keys in his fist, the ring in his pocket, a child's voice in his head. Daddy has one like that. He told himself it meant nothing. People wore similar watches. Children said things without understanding what they were saying. There were 100 explanations. But then the math started. He didn't want it to. He tried to stop it the way you try to stop a song from playing in your head. But the numbers came anyway, quiet and merciless. The boys looked 3. Maybe just past 3. He and Vivian had ended their engagement 3 years and 2 months ago. Nathaniel stood in the parking structure until a car behind him honked, and he realized he'd been standing in the lane without moving. He got in his car. He didn't start it. He sat there with his hands on the wheel and one question he couldn't make stop. Who is Daddy, and why did Vivian look afraid the moment that boy said it? If this story is already pulling at something in you, you're not alone. Drop a comment and let us know what you're thinking. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here when Chapter 2 drops. Because what Nathaniel discovers next will change everything he thought he understood about why she really left. Nathaniel didn't sleep. He lay on top of his bed still in his work clothes, the ring on the nightstand, staring at the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes he saw the same thing, a small boy looking at his watch with a familiarity that made no sense. He told himself to stop. He told himself there were 100 explanations. He almost believed it. By 4 a.m., he'd given up on sleep entirely. He went to the kitchen, made coffee he didn't drink, and stood at the window watching the city go quiet. And that was when the memory hit him, not gradually, but all at once, the way the worst ones always do. 5 years ago, Nathaniel Cole had been the kind of man who believed timing was everything. He was 31. He'd just made junior partner at one of the most competitive firms in the city. He was sharp, driven, and completely certain that he had the next decade of his life mapped out. The only thing that ever made him feel slightly off balance was Vivian. Not in a bad way. In the way that mattered. He proposed on a Tuesday, which surprised even him. No reservation, no speech. They were sitting in a restaurant they'd been to a dozen times, and she was laughing at something he'd said, and he just knew. He had the ring in his coat pocket because he'd been carrying it for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. And he finally understood there was no right moment. There was just her, laughing, and him being too afraid to wait any longer. She said yes before he finished asking. 6 weeks later, she was gone. No conversation. No warning. Just a letter, hand-delivered to his office by his older brother Gerald. 4 sentences. I can't be what you need. I'm sorry. Please don't look for me. This is the kindest thing I can do. He'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Gerald had been there for all of it, the days after, the silence, the slow process of learning to stop checking his phone for a message that never came. Gerald was the one who told him to focus on work. Gerald was the one who said Vivian had made her choice, and that chasing her would only make it worse. Nathaniel had believed him. He trusted Gerald the way you trust someone who was there when everything fell apart. You don't question the person who held you together. You just don't. He picked up his phone at 7 a.m. and called Gerald. It rang twice. Nate. Gerald's voice was smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who had already had his coffee and read his emails and decided how his day would go. What's up? I went to see Vivian last night. At the hospital. A pause. Short, but there. Is she all right? She's fine. But Gerald, Nathaniel stopped. He wasn't sure how to say the next part. She had 2 kids with her. Boys. They looked about 3 years old. Nothing on the other end. No sharp intake of breath. No what? No, are you serious? Just a quiet that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. Okay, Gerald said finally. And? Nathaniel waited for more. It didn't come. That's all you've got? And? Nate. Gerald's tone shifted, not to concern, but to something that sounded like patience being carefully managed. She moved on. People move on. You went there without telling anyone, she returned the ring, and now you're reading into a hospital visit. Let it go. Let it go. Not that strange. Not 2 boys, wow. Not even are you okay? Just, let it go. Nathaniel ended the call and sat with the phone in his hand. Gerald hadn't asked a single question about the boys. Not their names. Not who their father was. Not why any of it felt off. People ask questions when something surprises them. Gerald hadn't been surprised. Nathaniel went to the closet shelf where he kept things he'd never fully thrown away, the kind of shelf that exists in every home as a graveyard for things you can't explain keeping. He found the box without having to look too hard. Inside was the engagement party photo. Someone had printed it for him months later, after everything. He'd kept it without really knowing why. He and Vivian were in the foreground, clearly happy, clearly unaware of the camera. He'd looked at this photo 100 times. He knew exactly what was in it. But he'd never looked at the background. Gerald and Vivian were standing near the far wall. Not casually. Not like 2 people making small talk at a party. They were turned toward each other, and even in a blurry background, the body language was obvious. They were arguing. Nathaniel tilted the photo toward the light. Vivian's shoulders were tight, her chin lifted, the way she looked when she was trying not to raise her voice. Gerald's hand was out, palm up, like he was explaining something. Or demanding something. 6 weeks before she disappeared. Nathaniel put the photo down on the table and looked at it for a long time. He was trying to remember if he'd ever seen them in the same room after that night. He was trying to remember if Gerald had ever mentioned knowing her well. He couldn't place a single conversation. His phone buzzed. A text. From Dara, a friend who'd been part of their circle years ago, someone who'd drifted after the breakup the way mutual friends always do. He read it once. Then again. You shouldn't have gone there. She's been through enough. Nathaniel stared at the message. He hadn't told Dara he went to the hospital. He hadn't told anyone except Gerald, and that call had been less than an hour ago. He typed back, "How did you know I was there?" The typing bubble appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. Then nothing. No reply came. Nathaniel set the phone on the table next to the photograph, the photo where Gerald and Vivian were arguing at a party neither of them had ever mentioned. He looked at both of them for a long moment. Gerald already wanted this buried. And someone had told Dara he'd gone to the hospital before Nathaniel had told a single person. The question wasn't just who is Daddy anymore. The question was, how many people already knew something that Nathaniel didn't, and how long had they been keeping it from him? Dara never replied. Nathaniel waited an hour, then sent one more message, "Just how did you know?" And got nothing. No read receipt. No typing bubble. Just silence on the other end of a question that shouldn't have been hard to answer. He put the phone down and looked at the engagement party photo still on the table. Gerald and Vivian in the background. Mid-argument. 6 weeks before she vanished. He wasn't ready to say what he was thinking. Not yet. But he needed one more piece before he could talk himself out of it. Nathaniel had spent enough years in corporate law to know how hospitals worked. Medical proxy cases, patient record disputes, emergency contact verifications, he'd navigated all of it professionally. He knew which questions sounded routine and which ones raised flags. He called the hospital mid-morning, introduced himself using his firm's name, and kept it simple. He was following up on behalf of a client. He needed to verify the emergency contact listed for a patient admitted 2 nights ago. Room 412. Vivian Marsh. The administrator checked. Came back. The emergency contact wasn't her mother. Wasn't a sibling. Wasn't a friend Nathaniel recognized. The name on the form was Harlan. Nathaniel wrote it down even though he already knew he wouldn't forget it. He thanked the administrator and ended the call. Then he opened his laptop and started searching. Harlan didn't appear in any of his professional contacts. No LinkedIn presence he could find. No connection to any firm or case he'd personally handled. He was a ghost, the kind that only exists in paperwork. Except. Nathaniel pulled up the firm's internal records archive, which he still had access to from a case 2 years ago involving estate transfers. He typed the name into the search field more out of habit than expectation. One result came back. A land trust. Established 3 years ago. Managed by Gerald Cole, senior partner. The trust had a secondary signatory, Harlan, listed as legal counsel for the trust's primary beneficiary. Nathaniel read that line 3 times. He didn't know what a land trust had to do with a hospital emergency contact form. He didn't know why a man connected to Gerald's private legal work would be listed as Vivian's person to call in a crisis. He didn't know what any of it meant. But the name was there. In Gerald's records. 3 years ago. The same window as the boys. He needed to see Claudette. Vivian's mother had always liked Nathaniel, genuinely, not just politely. During the engagement she'd called him the steady one, which he'd taken as a compliment and which Vivian had found hilarious. After the breakup, Claudette had gone quiet in the way people do when they're loyal to their child and heartbroken about it at the same time. He called ahead so it wouldn't feel like an ambush. Told her he'd heard about the accident and just wanted to check in. She said come by for tea, the way she always had, like no time had passed at all. Her house was exactly the same. Same front steps, same wind chime by the door, same smell of something baking the moment she opened it. She hugged him without hesitation, and for a moment Nathaniel felt the 3 lost years like a physical weight. They sat in the kitchen. Claudette asked about the firm, about whether he was eating properly, about nothing important. She was warm. She was also watching him carefully behind every smile. He waited until the tea was poured. "Vivian seems to be doing all right," he said. "I stopped by the hospital." Claudette's hands didn't move. "I know." Of course she knew. He let it go. "The boys seem healthy," he said. "How old are they now?" A small pause. 3.5. She offered nothing else. Nathaniel wrapped both hands around his mug. "They're great kids," he said. "You must love having them around." For the first time, Claudette's expression softened, genuinely, not carefully. "They're everything," she said. And then, quietly, "They're happy. That's all that matters now." Now. As if there had been a before where they weren't. Before Nathaniel could follow that thread, there was a sound from the hallway, small feet on hardwood, and one of the boys appeared in the doorway. He was still in his pajama top, holding a folded piece of paper, looking at Nathaniel with the calm assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend not to stare. Nathaniel recognized him from the hospital. The quieter one. The boy walked to the table and placed the paper in front of Nathaniel without saying anything. Then he stood there waiting. Nathaniel unfolded it. A drawing. Crayon on the back of an envelope. 3 stick figures, 2 small ones standing close together, and a taller one off to the side, slightly separate from the others. "Who's this?" Nathaniel asked, pointing to the 2 small figures. "Me and my brother," the boy said. "And this one?" Nathaniel pointed to the tall figure. The boy looked at it for a moment. Then he said, simply, "Him." "What's his name?" The boy glanced toward the hallway, toward his grandmother, then back at the drawing. He didn't answer. He picked the paper back up, folded it carefully, and walked out of the kitchen. Nathaniel sat with the silence he left behind. He looked at Claudette. She was looking at her tea. The tall figure in the drawing had a single detail the others didn't. A small rectangle below the neck. Not a necklace. Not a button. A tie. Nathaniel was the only person in the room wearing a tie. He waited another few minutes before he asked. He didn't want to ask. Asking made it real in a way that the watch, and the photo, and Harlan, and the drawing hadn't quite made it yet. But he'd run out of ways to circle around it. "Claudette." He kept his voice even. "Who is their father?" She didn't flinch. She didn't look away dramatically or get up from the table. She just looked down at her hands, at her fingers wrapped around the mug, and stayed quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to mean something. Then she looked up. "That," she said, "is Vivian's story to tell. Not I don't know. Not I'm not sure. Not even why are you asking?" She knew. She had known the whole time he'd been sitting at her table. And she had made a choice, carefully, deliberately, not to be the one to say it out loud. Nathaniel drove home with both hands on the wheel and one image he couldn't stop seeing, a child's drawing of a tall stick figure with a tie. The boy hadn't given the figure a name. But he hadn't said he didn't know it either. He just looked toward the hallway, as if checking whether he was allowed to answer, and then walked away. Someone had taught him not to say. Nathaniel gave himself one night to sit with everything he knew. The name on the hospital form. The land trust connection. Claudette's careful silence. A boy who drew a tall figure with a tie and then walked away without explaining it. By morning, he had made a decision. He wasn't going to circle this from the outside anymore. He was going to walk straight into the center of it and ask the one person who kept appearing at the edges of every question. He called Gerald at 8 a.m. and said 4 words, "We need to meet." Gerald's office was on the 14th floor, corner room, city view, the kind of space that announced how far a person had climbed. Nathaniel had always found it impressive. Today it just felt like distance. Gerald was standing when Nathaniel walked in, which meant he'd been expecting this to be a serious conversation. He gestured to the chairs across from his desk, the ones reserved for clients and difficult discussions. Nathaniel sat. Gerald didn't. "You already know why I'm here," Nathaniel said. It wasn't a question. Gerald looked at him for a moment, then nodded slowly and moved to his chair. He sat down, straightened a pen on his desk that didn't need straightening, and said, "She called me. About 3 months after you two ended. She wanted to make sure you wouldn't come looking for her." The words landed calmly. Too calmly for a confession. "She called you," Nathaniel repeated. "I was your brother. She thought I had influence over you." Gerald spread his hands, a gesture of reasonableness. "She said she'd moved on. That there was someone new. That she needed a clean break and she was afraid you'd try to reach her. So you just, what? Agreed to run interference?" "I agreed to respect her wishes." Gerald's voice was even. Measured. "She was asking me not to interfere in her life, Nate. That seemed reasonable. I thought the kindest thing I could do for both of you was stay out of it." Nathaniel listened to all of it. He let it settle. He turned it over the way you turn over something you found on the ground, not sure yet whether it's valuable or just a rock. It was a good story. That was the problem. It had the right shape. It had a logic to it. Vivian, scared and wanting a clean start. Gerald, trying to protect his brother from chasing someone who'd already moved on. It was almost exactly the kind of story you'd believe if you wanted to believe it. Nathaniel almost did. "Why did she call you specifically?" he asked. Gerald didn't hesitate. "I told you, she knew I could." "She barely knew you, Gerald." Nathaniel kept his voice level. "In 5 years, I can count on one hand the number of times you were in the same room. She never called you. She never texted you. You weren't on her contact list." He paused. "So why, out of every person she could have reached out to, did she go straight to you?" The silence lasted 1 beat too long. Not dramatically long. Not the kind of pause that announces guilt. Just 1/2 second past the natural rhythm of the conversation. The kind of pause a very good liar makes when they need to choose between two prepared answers. She found my number through a mutual contact, Gerald said. I don't remember who. Nathaniel nodded slowly, like he was filing that away. Then he reached into his jacket and placed the engagement party photo on the desk between them. Gerald looked at it. His expression didn't change, and the fact that it didn't change at all was its own kind of answer. Background, Nathaniel said, pointing. You and Vivian. That argument, what was it about? Gerald picked up the photo. Glanced at it the way you glance at something you've already seen before. Work stress, he said. I was in the middle of a rough quarter. I was probably venting to whoever was nearby. I don't remember the specifics. You were arguing with my fiancé at our engagement party about work stress. People have conversations at parties, Nate. Not like that. Nathaniel tapped the photo once, then put it back in his jacket. Not with that body language. Not 6 weeks before she disappeared. Gerald set his elbows on the desk. His voice shifted, not harder, but more careful. I understand you're trying to find a pattern here. I understand why. But I think you went to that hospital expecting one thing, you found something you didn't understand, and now you're building a story around it. He looked directly at Nathaniel. Don't do that to yourself. She moved on. The boys have a father. Leave it alone. There it was again. Leave it alone. The same phrase. The same tone. The exact same instruction he'd given on the phone 2 days ago. Not you're wrong. Not here's what actually happened. Just, stop looking. Nathaniel stood up. He said thank you for the time, which was the polite version of nothing, and he left. He was home by 7. He made dinner he didn't taste, answered 2 work emails he didn't care about, and sat on the couch in the dark trying to decide what he actually believed. Gerald's story wasn't impossible. That was the honest truth. It was uncomfortable and slightly off, but uncomfortable and slightly off didn't make it false. People contacted unexpected people in moments of panic. Coincidences existed. Arguments at parties meant nothing. He was almost, ready to let his shoulders drop and accept that he was building a case out of grief and a child's drawing. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. No contact name. The message was 7 words. Ask Gerald what he offered her to leave. Nathaniel read it twice. Then a 3rd time. He looked at the number, a string of digits he didn't recognize, the kind that don't belong to anyone in a contacts list, the kind people use when they don't want to be found. He typed back, "Who is this?" The message didn't deliver. The number was already gone. Nathaniel put the phone face down on the coffee table and stared at the wall. Someone out there knew something specific. Not a rumor. Not a guess. They used the word offered, which meant payment, or a deal, or a threat dressed up as a choice. And they hadn't sent that message by accident. They'd been watching. Waiting for exactly this moment, for Nathaniel to start pulling at the right threads. Gerald's story had almost worked. Someone had made sure it didn't. The unsigned message had come from someone who knew. The question was whether that someone was willing to say it out loud. Nathaniel spent one day tracking the number, dead end, as expected, a prepaid line already disconnected. So he went back to the only person who had already shown she was watching from the edges of this thing, who had texted him about the hospital visit before he'd told a soul. He drove to Dara's apartment and knocked on the door without calling first. She opened it, saw his face, and stepped back to let him in. Dara looked like someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a long time and still wasn't ready for it. She made tea neither of them drank, sat across from him at her kitchen table, and kept her hands wrapped around the mug like she needed something to hold on to. I sent the message, she said. No preamble. No denial. I know. Nathaniel kept his voice even. Tell me what you know about Gerald. She exhaled slowly. Then she told him. Gerald had found out about a fraud investigation, internal, at the firm, approximately 3.5 years ago. A partner had been flagged, and the early paperwork had included Nathaniel's name as a secondary contact on several accounts. It wasn't a real exposure. Anyone who looked carefully would have cleared him quickly. But Gerald hadn't looked carefully. Or, and this was the part Dara said carefully, Gerald hadn't wanted to wait to find out. He'd gone to Vivian directly. Told her Nathaniel was about to be buried in a federal investigation. That anyone close to him would be scrutinized. That the kindest thing she could do, for herself, and for him, was take a settlement, sign an agreement, and disappear cleanly before the inquiry expanded. The settlement was real. Signed and sealed. Gerald had used firm resources to draft it through a private channel, that was the Harlan connection. Harlan wasn't Vivian's person. He was Gerald's attorney, the one who handled the paperwork that Gerald didn't want attached to his own name. Nathaniel sat with all of it for a moment. How long have you known? He asked. Dara looked at her hands. She told me after she signed. She made me promise not to say anything. She paused. I kept that promise for 3 years. And then you walked into that hospital, and she stopped. I couldn't keep it anymore. Nathaniel drove home in the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It just feels like everything has stopped. He understood now. All of it, finally, in a shape that made sense. Gerald hadn't done it out of malice, or at least, that's how Gerald would tell it to himself. He'd done it to protect the firm. To control the exposure. To cut away anything that could complicate a situation before it had time to become one. Vivian hadn't left because she stopped loving Nathaniel. She'd left because his own brother had handed her a check and a reason to believe staying would destroy him. And she had been 3 weeks pregnant. Alone. Terrified. Handed a document by a man in an expensive suit who told her this was the only way to keep Nathaniel safe. She'd taken the offer. The boys had another father, a name on a form, a legal arrangement, a life built on the wreckage of a decision made in a moment of fear. And Nathaniel had spent 3 years not knowing any of it, because Gerald had told him to move on and he had. The math worked. The story was complete. It was devastating, but it was done. He picked up the phone and called Gerald. Gerald answered on the second ring. I know about the settlement, Nathaniel said. I know about Harlan. I know what you did. Silence. Then, Nate. I'm not calling to fight. Nathaniel's voice was steady. He'd made this decision on the drive home and he wasn't changing it now. I'm calling to tell you I know, and that I'm not going to burn the firm down over it. Whatever you thought you were doing, I'm not interested in destroying everything we built over a choice you can't undo. The pause on Gerald's end was short. Thank you, Gerald said. 2 words. Quiet. Simple. And something about them landed wrong. Not the words themselves. The relief underneath them. Nathaniel had just told his brother he was letting go of something enormous, and Gerald sounded less like a man receiving forgiveness and more like a man who just watched a door close on a room he didn't want anyone entering. Nathaniel ended the call and sat in his car in the dark for a long time. Thank you. Not I'm sorry. Not I should have told you years ago. Just relief. Clean and immediate, like a man who had been waiting to find out whether something dangerous had been contained. He told himself he was reading too much into 2 words. He almost believed it. He was in bed by 11. Not sleeping, just lying there with the ceiling and the silence and the version of the story that finally fit together, even if fitting together felt like a punishment rather than a resolution. Vivian had left because Gerald gave her no real choice. The boys had a legal father who wasn't Nathaniel. 3 years were gone. There was nothing left to investigate, nothing left to uncover, nothing left to do except accept it and figure out how to live with it. His phone lit up on the nightstand. Unknown number, but a different one this time. Not the burner from before. He answered. Nathaniel. Her voice was quiet. Careful. The voice of someone who had picked up the phone and put it down several times before finally letting it ring. Vivian. He sat up slowly. I'm here. A long pause. He could hear her breathing. Whatever Gerald told you, she said, and whatever you think you understand right now, I need you to know that I never stopped. The call cut out. Not a hang-up. A drop. Dead signal, mid-sentence, the way calls die when someone is on the edge of saying something they've needed to say for 3 years. Nathaniel pulled the phone from his ear and stared at the screen. No signal. Then 1 bar. He called back immediately, straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same. He set the phone down. I never stopped. Never stopped what? He sat in the dark with an incomplete sentence and the sound of her voice, and understood that the story he decided was finished 20 minutes ago was not finished at all. She hadn't called to explain. She hadn't called to apologize. She had called because something was still there, something she'd been carrying for 3 years in silence, and tonight, for the first time, she had almost let it out. Whatever you think you understand right now. Not, Gerald told you the truth. Not, now you know everything. Whatever you think you understand. Nathaniel lay back down. Stared at the ceiling. The version of the story that had made sense an hour ago had developed a crack down the middle, and he could feel the air coming through it. Why would she call, if it was over? Vivian never called back. Nathaniel tried 3 more times the following morning. Each one went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. What would he have said? I need to know how that sentence ended. He already knew that. He just needed her to say it. By noon, Dara texted him. Not about Vivian. About the settlement. I have the actual document. Come get it. Dara had printed it. 12 pages, legal formatting, the kind of document that takes a real attorney and real money to produce. She handed it to Nathaniel at her front door without any introduction, like she'd been waiting all morning to get it out of her hands. He sat in her living room and read it. The first 8 pages were exactly what he expected. Standard language. Confidentiality clauses. The payment amount, which was significant enough to tell him Gerald had taken this seriously. A non-disclosure agreement that covered the circumstances of the breakup, the existence of the settlement, and any communications between Vivian and Gerald or his representatives. Nathaniel read it carefully, but not slowly. He was looking for confirmation of the story he already knew. He found it on page 9. One clause. Tucked between a liability waiver and the signature block, in the same clean legal font as everything around it, which was the point. It was written to be read past, not read carefully. He read it 3 times. Vivian agreed to designate R. Harlan as the legal father of record for any children born within 18 months of the agreement's signing date. The designation was to be reflected in all birth documentation. No contest or legal challenge to this designation was permitted under the terms of the agreement. Nathaniel set the document on his knee. Dara was watching him from the doorway. He knew, Nathaniel said. She nodded. Quietly. Like she'd been carrying that word for a long time. Gerald hadn't just paid Vivian to leave. He hadn't just wanted a clean exit before a fraud investigation. He had written a legal clause into a private settlement, before the boys were born, that preemptively erased any question of who their father was. He had structured the entire agreement around a pregnancy he knew about and a paternity he intended to bury. R. Harlan wasn't Vivian's emergency contact. He wasn't a man she'd chosen. He was a name Gerald had placed on a document before the boys had taken their first breath, and then attached to them for 3.5 years. Nathaniel stood up. He folded the document, put it in his jacket, and left without saying much else. There was only one place to go. Vivian answered the door on the second knock. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her hair was down, and she was holding a dish towel she'd clearly forgotten she was holding. When she saw Nathaniel's face, something in her own face shifted, not surprise. Inevitability. Like a person who has been dreading a specific moment and has finally stopped dreading it because it's here. She stepped back. He walked in. The apartment was quiet. Boys' shoes by the door, 2 small pairs, side by side. A drawing on the coffee table that looked like a house with too many windows. Nathaniel looked at it for 1 second and looked away. He took the document out of his jacket and held it toward her. Not aggressively. Just, here. This exists. She looked at it. She didn't reach for it. You've read it, she said. The Harlan clause. He kept his voice level. Gerald wrote that in before the boys were born. He knew you were pregnant when he came to you. Vivian set the dish towel on the back of the couch. She sat down slowly, like someone who had run out of the energy it takes to stay standing. Yes, she said. 1 word. No defense in it. He didn't tell me what the clause meant at first, she said. He explained it as a formality, that it would protect me, protect the boys, give them a stable legal identity without complications. He said it was for their benefit. She paused. I was 8 weeks pregnant. I was alone. I'd just been handed a document that told me the man I loved was about to lose his career, and that me staying was the thing that would cost him it. She looked at her hands. I signed it because I believed him. He threatened to have me disbarred, Nathaniel said. It wasn't a question, Dara had already told him that part. He just needed to hear it in the same room as her. He said if I didn't sign and disappear quietly, he'd build a case against you and take you to the bar himself. That he had documentation. That he could make it look real. Her voice was steady but thin, the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed this conversation in their head many times and is now discovering it hurts more out loud. I didn't know if it was true. I just knew I couldn't risk it being true. Nathaniel stood there with the document in his hand and 3 years of silence suddenly accounted for, all of it real, all of it terrible, all of it making complete and devastating sense. He had one question left. The only one that had mattered from the beginning, from a hospital room, from a boy looking at his watch, from a drawing with a tall figure in a tie. Vivian. His voice was quiet. Are they mine? She looked at the floor. The apartment was completely silent. Then she looked up. Her mouth opened. And a small voice came from the hallway. One of the boys, Owen, the curious one, the one who asked questions that arrived like small stones dropped into still water, was standing in the doorway in his socks, looking at Nathaniel with the open, uncomplicated attention of a child who doesn't yet know that some moments require him to wait. He looked at his mother. Then at Nathaniel. Then back at his mother. And he asked, in the simple, honest way that only a 3-year-old can. Mama, is this our dad? The room stopped. Vivian's expression broke open, not into tears, not into anger, but into something rawer than either of those. Something that looked like 3.5 years of holding a truth in a closed fist, and finally feeling the fingers give way. She didn't answer him. She couldn't, yet. But the look on her face, the way she glanced from her son to Nathaniel and couldn't quite look away, was already the most honest answer in the room. If you felt that question in your chest the same way Nathaniel did, you're not alone. Drop a comment and tell us what you think Vivian's answer is going to be. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because Chapter 7 is where everything Nathaniel thought he understood is about to get a great deal more complicated. Vivian had said yes. She'd answered Owen's question quietly, after guiding him back to his room with a gentleness that looked like it cost her something. Then she'd come back to the living room, sat down across from Nathaniel, and said it plainly, "Yes. They're yours." 3 words. 3.5 years late. Nathaniel had driven home in the kind of silence that isn't empty, it's full of things too large to speak yet. He had 2 sons. He had always had 2 sons. And someone had spent 3 years making sure he never found out. That someone had a name. Harlan. And Nathaniel was done letting him stay on paper. It took Nathaniel 2 days to build a complete picture of who Harlan actually was. Not a random associate. Not a name Gerald had borrowed for a legal formality. Harlan, Raymond Harlan, was Gerald's personal attorney. The man Gerald called when he needed things handled quietly, off the firm's official record. He drafted the settlement, written the paternity clause, and signed his own name to a legal declaration establishing himself as the father of 2 boys he had never once met. And for 3 years, he had been paid for it. Nathaniel found the payments through the same firm archive that had first surfaced Harlan's name, a shell account connected to Gerald's private holdings, disbursing a fixed amount every month like a subscription. Not a one-time fee. A retainer. Gerald hadn't just bought Harlan's signature. He was maintaining it. Keeping the arrangement active, keeping Harlan cooperative, keeping the legal wall between Nathaniel and his son standing. The declaration itself was the problem. Under it, Harlan was the boy's legal father of record. Overturning it meant a court order. It meant a DNA test, either Vivian's consent or a judge compelling one. It meant lawyers and filings and months of a process that would put Eli and Owen directly in the middle of a legal fight they were 3 years old and completely unprepared for. Nathaniel stared at the file he'd assembled and understood that knowing the truth and being able to prove it in a way that didn't damage the boys were 2 entirely different things. He called Gerald. They met at the firm, after hours. Gerald's office felt different at this time of night, emptier, the city view darker, the careful professional presentation stripped back to just 2 brothers in a room where something had broken between them. Gerald didn't deny the Harlan payments when Nathaniel laid it out. He didn't flinch at the shell account. He just sat behind his desk with his hands folded and let Nathaniel finish. Then he said, "What do you want to do with this?" "I want Harlan's declaration overturned," Nathaniel said. "I want my name on their birth certificates." Gerald nodded slowly. Like he'd expected exactly that. Like he'd already prepared for exactly that. "Then you're going to court," Gerald said. "You understand what that means. Filings become public record. The settlement gets scrutinized. Vivian gets deposed. The boys, 3 years old, Nate, get pulled into a legal process that will take the better part of a year, minimum." He paused. "And at the end of it, even if you win on paternity, you'll be the man who dragged their mother through a court battle to get there." Nathaniel looked at him. "You're describing consequences of something you created. I'm describing consequences that fall on people who aren't me." Gerald's voice was steady. Unbothered. The voice of a man who had already run the calculations. "I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying look at what it costs before you decide it's worth it." It was the same logic Gerald always used. Not a denial. Not an apology. Just a redirection toward damage, as if the damage he'd already caused didn't count because it had been quiet. Nathaniel left without responding. There was nothing to say that a court filing wouldn't say better. He went to Vivian's that evening, not to discuss legal strategy, just to see them. Vivian let him in without question. The boys were in the living room with building blocks, engaged in a disagreement about structural integrity that neither of them had the vocabulary to resolve. Eli, the louder twin, the one with opinions, was insisting a tower needed more blocks at the bottom. Owen was simply removing them one at a time and watching it wobble. Vivian went to the kitchen to make coffee, and Nathaniel sat on the floor near the blocks, which was apparently the correct thing to do because neither boy questioned it. They played in a loose, parallel way, not with him exactly, but not without him. Eli narrated his construction. Owen stayed quiet, focused, occasionally glancing at Nathaniel with the same calm assessment he'd shown at the hospital. After a while, Owen set down his block and moved to sit beside Nathaniel. Not dramatically. Just, closer. Nathaniel didn't move. Then Owen took his hand. Small fingers, unself-conscious, the way very young children reach for people they've decided they trust before they know why. He said, without any preamble at all, "My brother says you smell like our pictures." Nathaniel looked down at him. What pictures? Owen shrugged the way children shrug, full body, completely unconcerned. Mama's drawer. He said it the way he might say the kitchen or the backyard. A place. A known thing. Something that had always been there. Nathaniel sat very still. Vivian hadn't told the boys who he was. She'd been careful about that, careful about everything, the way a person is careful when they've spent 3 years protecting something fragile. She hadn't pointed at his photograph and explained. She hadn't given them a name. But she had kept photographs. In a drawer. In her home. For 3 years. And at some point the boys had seen them, enough times that Owen's brother recognized a person by their presence before he knew their face. Nathaniel didn't trust himself to speak for a moment. He looked at Owen's hand in his. This small, ordinary hand. 3 years old. His. He'd missed 3 years of these hands. He was in the parking lot when his phone rang. His attorney, a woman he'd called that morning to begin exploring his options quietly, carefully, without alerting anyone. Her voice was clipped and direct. We have a problem. Gerald Cole filed a preemptive motion this afternoon to formally reinforce the Harlan paternity declaration. He's citing the original settlement and requesting judicial confirmation. Nathaniel stood beside his car in the cold. He filed today. This afternoon. Before close of business. A pause. Nathaniel, someone told him you were moving. He had this ready. This wasn't reactive. He prepared it in advance and waited for a reason to file. Nathaniel stared at the ground. He had told 2 people he was considering legal action. His attorney, this morning. And Vivian, last night. He stood there a long time, not wanting to finish that thought. Someone had tipped Gerald off. And there were only 2 people who could have. Vivian had called him that morning. Not to explain Gerald's motion. Not to talk strategy. She said 4 words, come over. Just you. And then she hung up before he could ask anything. Nathaniel had spent the drive over cycling through every version of what that meant. Maybe she was frightened by the legal filing. Maybe she wanted to tell him she'd talked to Gerald. Maybe she was about to ask him to stop. He was wrong about all of it. The boys were at Claudette's. The apartment was quiet in a way it hadn't been any of the other times he'd been there, no small shoes by the door, no background noise of blocks or cartoons or the specific chaos that 2 3-year-olds generate simply by existing in a space. Vivian was standing when he came in. She didn't sit down. She walked directly to the bedroom hallway, paused, and looked back at him. There's something I need to show you, she said. He followed her. The drawer was in the nightstand beside her bed. Small. Ordinary. She opened it without ceremony and reached inside and handed him a single photograph. Not photographs, plural. 1. He recognized it immediately, the engagement party. Someone had printed it, and over the years the color had softened slightly at the edges. In the frame, he was laughing at something off-camera, head back, completely unguarded. He remembered almost nothing about that specific moment. It had just been a good night. But in the photograph, Vivian wasn't looking at whatever he was laughing at. She was looking at him. The way you look at something you're trying to memorize. The way you look at something you already know you're going to miss. Nathaniel turned the photograph over. On the back, in her handwriting, small, careful, the same handwriting from the letter that had ended them, was a date. Not the date of the party. A date 14 months later. The boy's birthday. He stood there holding it for a long moment. He understood what it meant. She had kept this one photograph for 3.5 years, and on the back she had written the day their sons were born. No names. No explanation. Just the date, like a private record of what this picture had cost her. He didn't trust himself to speak yet. They sat in the living room. Vivian had her hands in her lap, and she talked the way people talk when they've been holding something sealed for a very long time, carefully at first, then all at once. She had found out she was pregnant 2 days before Gerald came to her. 2 days. She'd been sitting with it alone, figuring out how to tell Nathaniel, running through every version of how that conversation might go. She'd been scared, but not in a bad way. In the way you're scared when something real is about to begin. Then Gerald knocked on her door. He had a folder. A printed fraud file with Nathaniel's name in the header. He sat across from her at her own kitchen table and explained, calmly, that Nathaniel was about to be investigated, that the inquiry would expand to anyone close to him, that she would be scrutinized and potentially named as a financial beneficiary of activity she knew nothing about. He told her the kindest thing, the most loving thing, she could do for Nathaniel was remove herself from the equation cleanly, before the investigation formalized. And then he set a settlement on the table. She'd asked for time. He said there wasn't any. He said every day she waited made it harder to protect Nathaniel. He said the document was already drafted, Harlan was already in place, and all she had to do was sign and the whole problem disappeared. She was 8 weeks pregnant. She was alone. And the man sitting across from her was telling her that she was the thing standing between Nathaniel and the destruction of everything he'd worked for. So she signed. "I was going to tell you," she said. Her voice was steady, but only barely. "About the pregnancy. I had it planned out, when I would call, what I would say. And then Gerald walked through the door 24 hours before I was ready, and by the time he left, I was someone who had signed a document agreeing to disappear." She paused. "I told myself I was protecting you. I think I believed it." Nathaniel looked at the photograph still in his hand. Him laughing. Her watching. "Why didn't you fight him?" he asked. "After you signed, why didn't you reach out, tell me what happened, give me the chance to?" "Because you didn't come after me." The sentence landed quietly. No drama in it. Just the flat, exhausted truth of someone who had waited for something that never came. "I kept thinking, he'll call. He'll reach out. He'll want to know why. And when you didn't," she stopped. "Gerald sent me a message. About a week after I signed. It said, he knows. He chose the firm." Nathaniel went very still. "He told me you found out about the settlement," she said. "That you knew I'd been paid to leave, and that you decided it was cleaner to let me go." She looked at her hands. "I didn't want to believe it. But you weren't calling. And Gerald's message was right there. And I was pregnant and alone and I needed a reason that made it make sense." She looked up. "So I believed him. And then I spent 3 years believing I had loved someone who chose his career over all of this." Gerald had sent that message a week after she signed. A week after she signed, Nathaniel hadn't known about any of it. He'd been sitting in his apartment reading a 4-sentence letter for the 100th time, trying to understand what he'd done wrong. Gerald had looked at a woman who was already gone, already silent, already grieving, and he had taken one more thing from her. Her ability to believe that Nathaniel had even tried to find her. Nathaniel understood now, fully and completely, what he was dealing with. Not a brother who had made a bad decision under pressure. Not a man who had prioritized the firm over family in a moment of fear. A man who had calculated, step by step, exactly how much damage he needed to cause, and had caused precisely that amount, and no more, and then gone back to his corner office and his city view and waited for everyone to move on. Nathaniel had trusted Gerald for a decade. He had let Gerald guide him through every major decision of his adult life. He had believed, without question, that Gerald was the person in his corner. And Gerald had used every bit of that trust like a tool. He looked at the photograph one more time. Her eyes on him. The date on the back. He placed it gently on the table between them. "Owen," he said quietly. "You named him Owen." Vivian looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, cracked open, just slightly. "You mentioned it once," she said. "You said it was your grandfather's middle name. You said it half-jokingly, like it was too old-fashioned. But she stopped. "I kept it." Nathaniel sat with that for a moment. A name he'd said once, half-jokingly, years ago, that she had carried into a delivery room alone and given to his son. He had one thing left to do. And it was going to cost him everything he had built, and he had already decided he didn't care. Gerald had lied to a pregnant woman to keep her silent. He had built a wall out of her grief and Nathaniel's absence and called it protection. And now Nathaniel was going to take that wall apart, brick by brick, filing by filing, whatever it cost, because on the back of a photograph in a nightstand drawer, someone had written a birthday that belonged to him. He just hadn't known it until now. Nathaniel had one question left that no one had answered. He knew about the settlement. He knew about Harlan. He knew about the monthly payments and the paternity clause and the message Gerald had sent Vivian to make sure she stayed gone. He knew all of it now, except the one thing underneath all of it. Why? Not the reasons Gerald had given. Not protecting Nathaniel or protecting the firm. The real reason. The one Gerald had never said out loud, because saying it out loud would have required him to admit what he actually was. Nathaniel went back to the firm archive. And this time, he didn't search for Harlan's name. He searched for Gerald's. The fraud file had always existed at the edge of this story. Gerald had used it as a weapon. He'd waved it in front of Vivian like a loaded gun and told her it had Nathaniel's name on it. Nathaniel had assumed that was a manipulation. A threat built on nothing. He was wrong about the nothing part. The file was real. There had been an internal inquiry, 3.5 years ago, into suspicious movement of client funds through a series of connected accounts. It was real, it was documented, and it had been quietly resolved before it ever escalated to formal investigation. Nathaniel's name appeared in the file twice, as a secondary contact on 2 accounts that had been flagged. Nothing more than that. Any attorney who looked at it for 10 minutes would have cleared him immediately. Gerald's name did not appear in the file at all. That was the first thing. The second thing was the land trust. Nathaniel had found it early in this process, the trust Gerald had managed, with Harlan as secondary signatory. He'd treated it as background context. He went back to it now with fresh eyes and spent 3 hours pulling every document attached to it. The trust was a pass-through. Client funds had moved into it, sat briefly, and moved out again, into accounts that weren't connected to any client. The trust had been structured to look like a legitimate estate management vehicle. From the outside, it looked exactly like the kind of work Gerald did every day. But the money that had passed through it hadn't belonged to any estate. It had belonged to clients of the firm. Clients whose accounts Nathaniel had also touched, not as the manager, but as a secondary contact. His name on those accounts wasn't incidental. It was load-bearing. Gerald had structured the accounts so that Nathaniel's fingerprints were present without Nathaniel's knowledge, creating a layer of distance between Gerald and the movement of the funds. Nathaniel wasn't the man Gerald had been protecting from a fraud investigation. He was the man Gerald had been hiding behind during one. The Vivian piece clicked into place last. She had attended a firm event 3.5 years ago. Nathaniel had brought her, early in the engagement, back when he'd still been integrating his life with hers. It had been a quiet dinner, nothing formal. She'd spent most of it talking to other partners' spouses, which meant she'd moved through several rooms, including the one where Gerald had met briefly with Harlan. She hadn't known what she was seeing. Why would she? She hadn't known who Harlan was. She hadn't known what document they'd signed at a side table during a dinner party, or why Gerald had glanced toward the door when she'd walked through it. But Gerald had known what she'd seen. And Gerald couldn't control what she might eventually remember, or connect, or mention to Nathaniel in an unguarded moment. So he'd removed her. Not because she was a liability to Nathaniel. Because she was a liability to Gerald. And the boys, having Harlan's name on their birth records, legally established through a sealed private settlement, had given Gerald one more layer of distance from the trust structure. Harlan's name attached to a family document made him appear to be a private individual with personal connections, rather than a legal instrument in a financial arrangement. Gerald had used Vivian's pregnancy. He had used Nathaniel's sons, before they were born, as paperwork in a cover story. Nathaniel sat back from his desk. He'd spent a decade trusting Gerald. Trusting his judgment, his instincts, his version of events. He'd let Gerald guide him through every fork in the road, and every time Gerald had pointed a direction, Nathaniel had gone. He picked up his phone and called him. Gerald was at the firm when Nathaniel arrived. It was past 9 in the evening. Gerald's office was lit, the city dark behind him, and when Nathaniel walked through the door, Gerald looked up from his desk and, for the first time in this entire ordeal, didn't arrange his face into anything. No calm. No performance. No measured patience. Just a man who had run out of distance between himself and what he'd done. Nathaniel put the documents on the desk. The trust records. The fund movements. Harlan's connection to the accounts. The timeline. Gerald looked at them. He didn't pick them up. The investigation, Nathaniel said. It was yours. Gerald said nothing. You put my name on those accounts. You used me as cover while you moved client money through Harlan's trust. And then when the internal inquiry started getting close, you panicked, and you went to my pregnant fiancée and told her I was the one being investigated. Nathaniel's voice was even. Completely level. You used her fear for me to get her out of the room. Because she'd seen you with Harlan. Because you couldn't risk what she might eventually figure out. Gerald's hands were still on the desk. He was looking at the documents, not at Nathaniel. Everything I built, Gerald said finally, I built for this family. Everything. The firm, the reputation, all of it, I was protecting what we had. You took my sons. 3 words. Nathaniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Gerald looked up. And for once there was nothing behind his eyes that resembled justification. I know, he said. Nathaniel walked out. His phone buzzed on the elevator down. Dara. A text, 3 sentences. It's done. I sent everything to the state bar and a federal contact I've been sitting on for 2 months. Gerald won't be walking into that office tomorrow. Nathaniel read it twice. Then he put the phone in his pocket and stood in the lobby of the building where he'd worked for a decade, and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief. His attorney called 60 seconds later. You need to hear this now, she said. Gerald's motion is already filed. Harlan's declaration still stands. A judge could confirm it within 48 hours if we don't counterfast. A pause. And Nathaniel, Vivian's name is on the original settlement as a voluntary participant. The opposing attorney will use that. She'll be exposed in the filing. All of it goes public. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment. Gerald was finished. The fraud was documented, forwarded, and on its way to people who would act on it. That part was done. But Harlan's name was still on his son's birth records. And the only way to remove it, in the next 48 hours, before a judge made it permanent, was to drag Vivian through a public legal proceeding that would put her name, her settlement, and the worst 3 years of her life on record for anyone to read. Nathaniel had come this far to protect his sons. Now he had to figure out if he could do it without destroying the woman who had protected them alone. If this story has been keeping you up, drop a comment and tell us what you think Nathaniel should do: fight the motion, or find another way. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here when the final chapter lands. Because some endings don't arrive the way you expect them to. Nathaniel's attorney filed the counter-motion at 6 a.m. Fraud in the inducement. For words that meant the original settlement was built on a lie, that Vivian had signed under manufactured threat, with false information, and that no court should treat a coerced signature as a voluntary one. It was the right argument. It was also a 48-hour race against a judge who didn't yet know what Gerald had done. Nathaniel sat in his attorney's office while she filed and thought about the partnership he was about to lose. 10 years of work. His name on the wall. He thought about it for about 30 seconds. Then he stopped thinking about it. The hearing was fast, by legal standards. 3 days. Harlan appeared through his own attorney and said almost nothing, because Gerald's arrest, which had come quietly on a Tuesday morning, had removed every reason Harlan had to keep performing a role that no longer paid. The fraud in the inducement argument didn't require a fight. It required documentation. Nathaniel's attorney laid out the manufactured fraud file, the shell accounts, the Harlan payments, the timeline. She showed that the threat Gerald had made to Vivian, the investigation that would destroy Nathaniel's career, had been built entirely from records Gerald himself had falsified using Nathaniel's name without his knowledge. The settlement had not been a choice. It had been a trap with a signature line. The judge voided it before lunch. Harlan's declaration collapsed with it. He didn't contest. He didn't even make eye contact with Nathaniel across the room. He was a man who had signed his name to something for money and was now very focused on not being more involved than he already was. The birth records would be corrected. The legal process would take a few more weeks: documentation, filings, the specific bureaucratic machinery of undoing 3 years of false paperwork. But the hearing was over, and when Nathaniel walked out of that room, Eli and Owen Cole were his sons on paper as well as in every way that had always been true. Vivian had come voluntarily. No subpoena. No legal pressure. She had called Nathaniel's attorney 2 days before the hearing and said she wanted to testify, and she had walked into that room in a gray coat with her hands quiet at her sides and told the truth so plainly and completely that the opposing attorney hadn't asked a single follow-up question. She described what Gerald had said at her kitchen table. What he had threatened. What he had placed in front of her while she was 8 weeks pregnant and completely alone. She described signing a document she didn't fully understand because a man she had no reason to distrust had told her it was the only way to protect someone she loved. She didn't cry. She didn't look for sympathy. She just said what happened, in the order it happened, and let it be what it was. Afterward, they sat outside the courthouse on a bench that was too cold for the season. The sky was pale. Neither of them spoke for a long time. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had just watched something large and heavy finally hit the ground, and needed a moment before they could move again. "You were good in there," Nathaniel said eventually. Vivian looked at the sky. "I've been practicing that testimony in my head for 3 years. A pause. "I just didn't know who I was giving it to." Nathaniel nodded. They sat a little longer. Then Vivian stood up, and Nathaniel stood up, and they walked to their separate cars. No declaration. No dramatic moment. Just two people who had a great deal of ground still to cover, and had quietly decided to start covering it. They told the boys on a Saturday morning, at Claudette's kitchen table, with orange juice and the particular low-stakes chaos that 2 3-year-olds generate before 9 a.m. Vivian kept it simple. The way you keep things simple for children, not because children can't handle truth, but because truth doesn't need decoration when it's already enough. She said that Nathaniel was their father. That he hadn't been able to be with them before now, but that he was here. That he was going to be part of their life. Eli immediately wanted to know if that meant Nathaniel would come to his birthday. Nathaniel said yes. Eli accepted this and went back to his orange juice. Owen was quieter, the way Owen was always quieter. He sat with it for a moment, turning it over in the way he turned everything over, carefully, without rushing. Then he looked at Nathaniel with the calm, direct attention that had unsettled Nathaniel in a hospital room what felt like a lifetime ago. "Were you lost?" Owen asked. Nathaniel looked at him. This small face. This serious question. "Yeah," he said. "I was." Owen thought about this. Then, as if it were a simple fact, as if it explained everything and required nothing further. We looked for you in pictures. The kitchen went quiet. Claudette turned toward the window. Vivian's hand moved to her coffee cup and stayed there. Nathaniel sat at the table with that sentence and understood that it was the truest thing that had been said in this entire story. Not the legal documents. Not the confrontations. Not the fraud file or the court order or the settlement that never should have existed. We looked for you in pictures. They had known something was missing. They had found the nearest version of him they had access to, in a drawer in their mother's bedroom, and they had looked. He hadn't been gone. He'd just been in the wrong place. Nathaniel lost the partnership. It went the way his attorney had said it would, quietly, as a formality, the firm protecting itself from the association with Gerald's case. He was offered a graceful exit. He took it. He opened a small practice 6 weeks later. 3 attorneys including himself. A corner office with a worse view and no prestige and complete control over the cases he chose to take. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he liked it considerably more. He moved into a house 3 blocks from Vivian's. Not next door. Not across the street. 3 blocks, close enough to walk, far enough to be honest about where they were, which was at the beginning of something, moving at the pace of people who had learned what rushing costs. The boys came over on weekends. Sometimes weekday evenings. It was not a perfect arrangement, it was 2 adults building something careful out of materials that had been badly damaged, and some days it was harder than others. But it was real. And it was theirs. The watch was on the kitchen counter the first Saturday morning Eli and Owen spent at Nathaniel's house. He'd left it there without thinking, the silver watch, his father's, his grandfather's before that. The one Owen had noticed in the hospital room, the one that had started the unraveling of everything. Eli spotted it before breakfast. He picked it up, turned it over once, and put it on his wrist. It slid past his hand and came to rest at his elbow. He looked at it there for a moment. Then he went to get cereal and didn't take it off. Later, while Nathaniel was making coffee and Owen was drawing at the kitchen table and Eli was sitting in the big chair with the watch still hanging off his elbow, Eli looked up and said, to no one in particular, to the room, to the morning. "Dad, when is breakfast?" Nathaniel turned around. 3 words. The most ordinary sentence. The kind of thing children say 100 times before they're 5, without weight, without drama, without any idea what they're giving someone. He stood at the counter for a moment. Then he said, 5 minutes, and turned back to the coffee. And for the first time in 3.5 years, maybe longer, nothing was missing. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, if it made you feel something real, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications, we have more stories like this one, and the next one is already waiting for you.